The Wild West, a time often romanticized in folklore but rife with harsh realities, shaped by men and women who carved their names into the annals of history. This world of lawlessness, risk, and rugged determination brought forth legends like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, men whose stories are woven into the fabric of American culture. Yet, countless tales remain hidden in the dusty corners of forgotten history. Among them is the story of Tombstone, Arizona. In the fateful year of 1881, the location of the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral. The air was thick with dust, the smell of sweat, whiskey, and the weight of impending conflict. Picture yourself there, your hand resting on the cool metal of your revolver, tension mounting with every step, every glance exchanged. In this world, gunfights and public hangings were routine, and survival depended on your ability to adapt to a brutal, unforgiving landscape. The Wild West was a paradox. It was a place where vast horizons held endless opportunities. Yet death could come swiftly, whether by the barrel of a gun or the mercilessness of nature. Louis L'Amour, the writer who captured the spirit of the frontier, famously said, "The trail is the thing, not the end of the trail." He spoke of a journey through an untamed land, a land that often threatened to swallow those who sought to tame it. As we venture into the harrowing realms of the Wild West, we delve into a time where life was cheap, danger was constant, and survival was never guaranteed. Welcome to the Diary of Julius Caesar, the mythic outlaws of the wild frontier, a land dominated by guns, gold, and ghosts. In the vast, sun-scorched landscapes of the West, legendary figures emerged not only as heroes but as anti-heroes, figures whose actions and reputations would echo through time. Men like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Butch Cassidy became symbols of rebellion and defiance against the constraints of society. These were men who embodied the complexity of the frontier, where morality was often as ambiguous as the law itself. Jesse James, for instance, was a symbol of the post-Civil War South. A former Confederate soldier turned outlaw, he embodied the spirit of resistance in a time when the nation was rebuilding itself. In 1876, he attempted to rob the First National Bank in Northfield, Minnesota. However, this heist ended in disaster. The James Younger gang was decimated, but Jesse managed to escape, further cementing his reputation as a man who could outwit both death and the law. To some, he was a folk hero, a modern-day Robin Hood. To others, he was a criminal, a symbol of lawlessness and rebellion. His story became one of myth and legend, written in lurid accounts by journalists like John Newman Edwards, a Confederate sympathizer who painted Jesse as a symbol of Southern defiance. Billy the Kid, standing at just 5 feet 7 inches, was another figure whose life was shrouded in mystery and moral ambiguity. At the age of 21, he had allegedly killed 27 men, though he claimed he only killed those who deserved it. Billy was a chess player in a world of checkers. His alliances with cattle barons and local strongmen during the chaotic Lincoln County War allowed him to survive, but his life was filled with bloodshed. His story is one of a man caught between the ideals of rebellion and the harsh reality of a world that offered no room for weakness. And then there was Butch Cassidy, whose real name was Robert Leroy Parker. He, along with his partner, the Sundance Kid, became infamous for their elaborate heists, most notably the robbery of the Union Pacific Overland Flyer in 1899. The gang made off with $50,000, an enormous sum for the time. Their exploits were not just about theft, but about survival. In a world where the law was often a distant concept, Butch and Sundance became icons, their story amplified by sensationalized newspaper reports and dime novels that set the public's imagination ablaze. In the Wild West, justice was as unpredictable as the land itself. Far from the stately courtrooms of the East, where justice was measured and deliberate, the frontier operated on a different set of rules. Justice could be swift, brutal, and sometimes arbitrary. Imagine a land where a man's fate could be decided not by a jury of his peers, but by a quick draw at the hands of a local sheriff, or worse, an angry mob. Frontier justice was as raw and unforgiving as the environment itself. In the case of Tom Horn, a scout and hired gunman, the evidence against him was flimsy at best, yet public sentiment led to his execution in 1903. Tom Horn's story is one of many where justice was less about facts and more about who had the power to make decisions. The absence of formal law enforcement led to the rise of vigilante groups, such as the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance, which took it upon themselves to police, judge, and execute those they deemed deserving of punishment. Figures like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok often acted as judge, jury, and executioner. Their decisions made at the business end of a revolver. Lynching became a common form of frontier justice, and minorities, particularly African Americans, Mexicans, and Native Americans, were disproportionately affected. The legacy of frontier justice is dark, filled with miscarriages of justice and the brutal reality of a world where lawlessness often reigned. While the Wild West is often remembered for its gunfights, gold rushes, and cowboys, the true cost of this era was paid by the indigenous peoples who had lived on the land for centuries before settlers arrived. The struggle between settlers and Native American tribes was one of the most significant and tragic aspects of frontier history. As settlers moved westward, they brought with them not just hopes of a new life, but an imposition of a new world order, a world in which the Native American way of life was seen as an obstacle to expansion. The violent clash of cultures was inevitable. As the U.S. government pushed its agenda of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent, regardless of the cost to those who were already living there. The Lakota Sioux, led by leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, fought fiercely to defend their ancestral lands from this encroachment. Their struggle came to a head during the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, a moment that remains iconic in American history. General George Armstrong Custer, overly confident in his military superiority, led the 7th Cavalry into battle against a much larger coalition of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. The result was a devastating defeat for Custer and his men, who were wiped out in what would come to be known as Custer's Last Stand. The battle was a rare and triumphant victory for Native Americans, but it was short-lived. The U.S. government soon retaliated with greater force, leading to further massacres and forced relocations. The legacy of the U.S. government's treatment of Native Americans is marred by betrayals and broken promises. The Long Walk of the Navajo in 1864 is another painful chapter in this tragic history. Under the leadership of Kit Carson, the U.S. military launched a scorched earth campaign against the Navajo people, destroying their homes and crops. Over 8,000 Navajo were forced to march hundreds of miles to a reservation in Bosque Redondo, New Mexico, where they were to be re-educated under the government's policies. Many died during the journey, and the suffering of the Navajo became a symbol of the broader plight of Native American tribes. This was not an isolated event. The Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, led by Colonel John Chivington, saw the slaughter of 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children who had been promised safety by the U.S. government. They were attacked and killed while camped peacefully. Such incidents continued to fuel the growing tension between settlers and Native Americans, and the frontier became a battlefield not just for land, but for survival and cultural preservation. The genocide and removal of Native American peoples from their lands were carried out under the guise of civilizing them, but in reality, it was about stealing their resources, land, and sovereignty. In the process, the Western Narrative was rewritten to justify the violence and exploitation that defined this period. Native American resistance, however, did not go unnoticed. Figures like Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and Geronimo became legends not only for their military prowess, but for their symbolic resistance to the loss of their culture and way of life. Despite the overwhelming forces aligned against them, these leaders continued to fight for their people's survival, making it clear that their resistance would not be easily crushed. The echoes of these unspoken wars reverberated through the generations, as Native Americans continued to fight for their rights long after the frontier had closed. The stories of the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and countless other tribes were often sidelined, but their struggles were central to the history of the Wild West. These wars were not just physical, they were wars of identity, culture, and survival. The myths of cowboys and outlaws are only one side of the story. The other side is a narrative of resistance, of warriors and leaders fighting not just for their land, but for their very existence. The Wild West is often portrayed as a land of opportunity and freedom, but for many minority groups, it was a harsh and unforgiving place. African Americans, Mexicans, Chinese immigrants, and Native Americans faced intense racial discrimination and violence, yet many fought for survival and found ways to carve out lives for themselves. These groups often had to navigate a world where opportunity was scarce and prejudice was rampant. African Americans, many of whom had been freed from slavery, sought refuge in the West, seeing it as a place where they could rebuild their lives. Figures like Nat Love, known as Deadwood Dick, became legendary cowboys, but for every success story, there were countless others who faced racial hostility and violence. Towns founded by African Americans, like those created through the Exoduster movement, were often battlegrounds for racial tensions, and the promise of freedom was frequently met with discrimination. Mexican Americans also faced significant hardships in the Wild West. After the U.S. won the Mexican-American War and gained vast territories through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, many Mexican landowners saw their rights and land violated. Figures like Joaquin Murietta, a bandit known as the Robin Hood of El Dorado, became symbols of resistance against the oppression Mexicans faced in the West. Murietta fought back, but his story highlights the struggles of Mexican Americans who were often marginalized and denied the fruits of their own land. Chinese immigrants faced similar challenges. Lured to the West by the promise of wealth, many Chinese men worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, but they were paid far less than their white counterparts and subjected to harsh working conditions. The U.S. government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, making it even more difficult for Chinese immigrants to live in the country. Their contributions to the West, especially in building the railroad, were vital but largely ignored by history. Native Americans suffered the most in the Wild West. Forced off their ancestral lands by the advancing tide of settlers, many Native American tribes resisted through fierce battles and military campaigns. Leaders like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo fought to protect their people, but they were ultimately overpowered. The forced relocation of tribes, such as the Cherokee's Trail of Tears, marked a devastating chapter in American history, and the subsequent destruction of Native American culture is one of the most tragic legacies of the frontier. Despite these struggles, minority groups in the Wild West displayed remarkable resilience. African American cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, Chinese laborers, and Native American warriors all played vital roles in shaping the history of the frontier. Their stories, though often overlooked, are crucial to understanding the full picture of the Wild West.